folks. Greetings from the Offensive Security Group here at Security 360, coming at you with a new episode of the Cyber Threat Perspective. You've got Mr. Spencer here and myself, Brad. Today, it is time to talk about the 2024 Verizon Data Breach Report. And so if you're not familiar with what that is, we're going to familiarize you with it, and we're going to kind of step through it and interpret and discuss the findings of the report. It's kind of a big deal, right, Spencer? This report is kind of well respected. It has a lot of good insights into what's going on in the cyber community. You want to just kind of like do an intro for it and give your initial thoughts on it?
Yeah, definitely. So the DBIR is the Data Breach Investigations Report. This report Verizon is the one who creates this and distributes it and does the analysis and everything. And like you said, it's data-driven analysis of cyber attacks, data breaches from all around the world. They combine their own research, investigations, and analysis that they've done as a company, and they take partner data as well. So, the big firms of the world, the big vendors, you name it, they probably have submitted some data, some analysis to be included in this report. And this has been published or produced by Verizon for 15 years now, which when you think about it, that's pretty impressive.
Yeah.
I remember reading it when it first came out, and meeting the folks behind the team actually in Albany at the New York State Cybersecurity Conference. Usually every year somebody from that team goes out to that conference and they do like an analysis and a talk and a presentation on it. But this is a really good report. It shows insights and analysis into cyber attacks, incidents, data breaches. And the way I like to use it is to look at some of these statistics, some of the data, and try to, form our own conclusions to steer and drive our security strategy, and kind of help us inform, on the things we're doing. Is it working? Are there things that are not working? What should we be paying attention to? So That's kind of the core of this conversation is, what are some of the key takeaways? What are the things that we should be paying attention to? What are some interesting things that have happened and some changes that we'll talk about as well from previous years? And, we'll debunk some of the AI buzz, right, and the myths or a lot of the hype around that, which the DBR touches on as well. So I'm looking forward to it.
No, I love it. I absolutely love it, man. Some not surprising things, that came through this just at a high level were the motivation behind threat actors and some of the techniques that they're using and stuff like that. So, kind of looking forward to stepping through it with you.
Yeah. So the first one, I'm going to share my screen. So if you're listening to the podcast via audio, I'm going to share my screen and show the DBIR report and just point out some of the findings of the section, just because I think the report is interesting. And if you've never seen it before, it's a very pleasing report. There's a lot of charts and graphs and pictures and things like that. So, and just as like an addendum to that statement is the footnotes. There's none here on this page, but the footnotes of this report are often very funny. They're amusing. They're entertaining, and they keep it kind of lighthearted. And I kind of like that about the DBIR. So,
agreed.
The first one is 14% of breaches involved in the exploitation of vulnerabilities as an initial access step had a 3x increase, so 180% increase. So it almost tripled from last year. And obviously there's some big vulnerabilities, some big attacks that made that number go up, like move it. But I think that's a substantial increase in vulnerability exploitation, right? And there's other data points that we're going to call out in this conversation as well that indicate that threat actors like vulnerabilities more now than ever, right? We're seeing ransomware groups use these as well. And we're seeing a stark increase and an increase in the speed at which those vulnerabilities are being exploited. Now, my perspective on this is it's not all vulnerabilities, right? It's specific vulnerabilities, specific products, specific technology stacks that are being exploited or vulnerabilities are being discovered in to then be exploited. So this is really interesting to me. This just is more evidence to suggest that if there's something on the internet it has to be patched right away, and you have to be looking at your attack surface and limiting it as much as possible, right?
Yeah. Yeah. This illustrates a shift in, or it should hopefully create a shift in how we manage vulnerabilities, right? And so the old traditional style of vulnerability management was, we would once a month push out patches, or once every other month, or whatever that schedule is. And if it was a high, our SLA was a month. If it was a medium, it was 6 weeks. If it was a low, it was 3 months, whatever, right? But the evolution of how attackers are coming after these vulnerabilities is such that you don't have that much time. Unless your SLA is hours, it's probably wrong. And so we have to kind of have a shift away from the traditional style of vulnerability management, which is this kind of rigid, scheduled, repeatable process. And I'm not saying we shouldn't do that, right? But what I'm saying is we have to evolve how that process is managed, to match what the threats are. And so in this particular case, like you're talking about, one of the things that we used to do in a past life when I worked with these programs is we also had a high risk vulnerability process. High risk meaning now we look at context. Is it being exploited? Is it on the public internet? Does it have client data behind it? Things like that. And so, this is kind of the long-winded thing to say that, let's keep our old rigid process in place. That's fine for everyday, not super important things, but let's also have a process for handling emergencies. And have a repeatable process to evaluate those too, right? Not all truly high risk, given the full context of the vulnerability, are rated as highs. We very frequently had mediums that came in, and because of the system, because of where they were, it became a high priority. We actually called it the high priority patching
Mhm.
working group or something like that, right? And there was a representative from everyone, and we were able to get ahead of these kind of things. But if you don't already have that in place, you're going to be behind the curve. So,
Yeah, definitely. And there's definitely a tone in the industry. I'm gonna switch it like that so it's a little bit bigger. There's
yeah,
definitely a
let's do it.
tone in the industry, and if you're paying attention and kind of following along, there's this tone of secure by default and secure design and third party supply chain management, which was a kind of a buzzword last year, year before. So there's definitely a shift in thinking, and I think it's a good shift. It's something that we should be cognizant of and kind of pushing towards. Um, the next one is related to ransomware, and it's that ransomware extortion accounted for a third of all breaches. So a third of all breaches were attributed to ransomware based on the data that Verizon has in this report. Again, we've said this probably many times, but this is not a surprise, and this is, I think ransomware is one of those things, Brad, that's always underreported.
Mm-hmm.
So
Yeah.
even the statistic here really probably doesn't show its true impact. And there's a lot of intangibles with ransomware. And when you compare it to things like BEC, which is very reported, right? It's
Yeah.
a very tangible metric. There's tangible numbers behind it, and you get a BEC and threat actor wire 700,000. Like that's an actual number that you can trace back.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, there's recovery time and an instant response and stuff like that. But with both, but this is obviously the opposite direction we want to go, right?
Yeah.
And there's some other things that we're talk about that if we can reverse will help with this. But I think this is a pretty eye-opening number to see that ransomware is still a big problem.
It is, and it's not going away, man. It's too effective and it's too lucrative, and I think you should already, folks, be looking at how you're going to handle ransomware. It's an old threat. This is not a new thing. You should have things like immutable backups. You should have things like recoverability and EDR and lateral movement detection and all the stuff that kind of floats around in that space. You should already be there, right?
Yep.
But we're not. Otherwise, this would be
Yep.
nosediving, right? So we're not there yet, but we should be because this is it's been around for a
Yep.
long time.
And I think of a quote So we spoke at ILTA Evolve last week, and in my presentation, one of the first slides, I had this quote, and it was that ransomware threat actors are really good at the basics, and it shows against organizations that aren't. And that, to me, that was somebody at Sans Defer, I think in 2023, that said that quote. And I don't know who to attribute that to, but that really resonates with me. Is that a lot of the stuff we talk about is very tried and true things. And can mitigate a lot of this stuff. So
blocking and tackling, dude.
Yeah. So the next one is more than 2/3, so 68% of breaches involve a non-malicious human element. So that's what this is here, this chart. So 68% involve a 68% involve a non-malicious human element. So non-malicious human element meaning errors, mistakes. You know, we see this a lot in banking and insurance, Brad. You've probably seen this too. It's like, oh, you accidentally send the payment information or some other PII to the wrong person because of the way Outlook works. And like you hit J and you tab their name and then you send it. So mistakes, errors, misconfigurations, that kind of thing. Same on the same page. So page 8, if you're following along, 15% of breaches involved a third-party supplier, such as software supply chains, hosting partner, infrastructure, data custodians. So again, we're still seeing, you know, a fair bit of breaches involving a third party. And this has including software vulns. And I think third party, you know, think of MSPs, right? IT vendors, third party software. You know, you look at the SolarWinds of the world and things like that. That is no surprise, but that is definitely a fair chunk of the pie in this case.
No, I completely agree, man. And you know, I've had this conversation with clients, and you know, their response in a lot of cases is there's only so much we can do. And to a degree, I agree with that. I think that we can do more than we'd like to admit when it comes to vendor management and integrating security requirements, integrating penalties and contracts to protect your organization from negligent third party, you know, vendors. And so I think we as an industry need to kind of drive that home and create that as a standard and make it the norm. But again, you know, we're not there yet. A lot of organizations have very immature acquisition and vendor management, you know, software acquisition, vendor management processes. And you know, this is one of those things where you know, I probably wouldn't call it blocking and tackling, and I would probably call this a very advanced and mature program to successfully make an impact on this risk.
Yep. Yeah, there's a certain amount of accountability that we have to try to put on vendors, on suppliers, right? And it's hard because there's big organizations like Microsoft that, you know, have done a lot in the way of security and technology, but there are still some things that are you know, very behind, or they're lacking, or they're just not quite there yet. And I think we have to continue having a you know, a discussion around how we move that needle forward to make sure that vendors are taking responsibility for some of these things, and we're not just dependent upon kind of patching and scanning for vulnerabilities and kind of waiting for things to happen. I think we have to get to a point where we're taking more of a proactive approach, especially with vendors.
I agree with that.
Cool. So jumping to page 17, there's a section on Gen AI. So I'm going to jump to page 17. It's here. So the DBR has a nice section here on AGI, artificial general intelligence, AI, and all that jazz. And essentially the TLDR here of what they did was they have insiders, you know, they have threat intelligence and they have information on these criminal forums. So on Tor networks, on dark web, things like that. There are criminal forums where people go to buy and sell credit card data, PII. You know, you can buy access to organizations from like an initial access broker, and all things like that. So what they did is they analyzed these forums, and specifically looking at when and where Gen AI or AI terms were mentioned. And essentially, their analysis was it revealed a low number of mentions of Gen AI terms alongside traditional attack types like phishing, malware, vulnerability, ransomware, with cumulative mentions barely reaching 100 cumulative mentions over the past 2 years.
Yeah, it's
So what
very
they're
low.
saying is, hey, we've analyzed the forums, the criminal forums where these threat actors hang out. And what we're seeing based on the data is that they might be talking about AI, but they're not talking about it in the context of some sort of malicious action against an organization. Right. So that to me is interesting. And that kind of like is contrary to the buzz and the hype that we hear. Like, oh,
Yeah.
AI is going to make phishing so much easier and la la la. And it's like, well, maybe it's just making it easier for red teamers.
Yeah.
You know?
Yeah, man. The buzz is exactly that, right? It's just an opportunity for vendors to get their name out in front of more people and have more conversations about new things. And so, fundamentally, AI hasn't even caused a blip on the cyber radar. Is it probably being used for phishing campaigns? Yeah. Is it going to fundamentally change the success or failure? Not really. I mean, these phishing campaigns are successful with poorly worded paragraphs and misspelled titles from Hotmail email addresses. Like, you don't
Yep.
need to be advanced with it, man. You can just send those really terrible phishing emails and they're going to work. So, why am I going to go spend the time, to really polish my phishing emails? So, yeah, man, I'm not seeing it. I know there was some concern about deep fakes and voice emulation and things like that. And look, man, before we reach that level of threat actor sophistication, the really dumb basic things have to stop working.
Yep.
And they haven't stopped working. So they're just going to continue to do business email compromise and extortion through passwords found on compromised databases and things that require, single digit IQ to execute properly before we move to, deep fake AI, stuff like that.
Yep.
Man, it's going to be a while if it
Yep.
happens at all.
Yeah, and it's not to say that this kind of stuff isn't happening, right? I'm sure
Sure.
there's some groups that are using
Oh, yeah.
uh, AI or Chat GPT, especially if you're not a native English speaker. Sure,
Mhm.
definitely, right? I don't think anybody says it's not happening. It's just at the scale that we're being marketed to and kind of the buzz around it.
Yeah.
It doesn't appear to be based on the data to be quite that prevalent as of yet.
Mhm.
But AI is a big shift. Like it's definitely a huge shift. It's a groundbreaking technology. There's no doubt it's going to be, foundationally important for all industries. But it's like anything else. Like it's a long tail. It's going to take some time,
Mhm.
and eventually it'll get there. But the hype is real.
It really is. Yeah.
Yeah. Another one that I really like that I think is a great point and kind of follows this trend that we were talking about earlier about how do we work towards secure defaults and focus on root cause of issues. So Jen Easterly, director of CISA, Cybersecurity Infrastructure Security Agency, has a short section here. And it says our goal should be to shift away from focusing on individual vulnerabilities and instead consider the issue from a strategic lens. By focusing on recurring classes of software defects, we can inspire software developers to improve the tools, technologies, and the processes and attack software quality problems at the root. Now, obviously, that's a very hopeful statement, and
Yeah.
I definitely
Easy to
agree with
say.
it. I think I think it's easy to say those things, and it's great, and I think it puts a positive spin on it. It's harder in implementation. I think it's harder in practice, but I do agree kind of with the sentiment, right, Brad, of like
Mhm.
trying to get to the root cause, trying to focus on classes of defects, classes of vulnerabilities. We've seen Microsoft patch and kind of fix some root causes in their products before. But I think there's so much money invested in things like vulnerability scanners and finding all these vulnerabilities. I think there's a lot of money invested in some of these things that the incentives to do the right thing of focusing on the root cause are not really thought about or talked about, right? I think that there's an incentive problem there that detracts us away from getting to that root cause, unfortunately.
Yeah, and look, talking about the culture of the industry, um, until and we've already really touched on this, right? In even this episode, until we as an industry start holding these software vendors accountable for producing crappy, insecure software, nothing's going to change. And so, man, we're still finding SQL injection on websites.
Mm,
That's a 30-year-old flaw that we've known about. There are tried and true practice ways to avoid having that in your environment. In fact, if I find SQL injection in your application, it just tells me that you're lazy,
right.
right? Because you're not even giving lip service to basic fundamental methods of building web applications. And so I pick on SQL injection because everybody understands it for the most part, and it's a common flaw, which just further illustrates my complaint. But the point that I want to get at though here is we as consumers of the software have to hold these vendors accountable, right?
Mm,
Vendors are not going to spend the extra money. They're not going to put in the extra effort, time, resource, etc., to build a robustly secure pile of software unless we make them.
yeah.
And so until there are, tangible impacts to their bottom line, i.e., we no longer buy their product because it has these security flaws in it, or it's just going to keep happening,
Yep.
And so we have to change how we do business.
Yeah, and I think a good example of this too is Active Directory. I'm a firm believer that 100% of the misconfigurations that occur within an Active Directory environment, and
Mhm.
just specifically looking at Active Directory itself, not the kind of the related tools or the related infrastructure for it, but just talking about Active Directory as as its own component, 100% of those vulnerabilities could be uh, completely prevented
Mhm.
if there was a tool or if there was a way that Microsoft built into it the ability to detect those misconfigurations. Because a lot of the things that we see in an Active Directory environment are things that could easily be avoided. It's like, well, you probably shouldn't put domain users in the domain admins group. Like
Right.
that should be very easy to identify before it happens, before you click OK and say, hey, this is not a typical group that you would include here. Like, are you sure you want to do this? A lot of those things I think are easily avoidable. We just haven't got to the point where that's an emphasis, right? We put the onus on the IT administrator to know, and we don't put in safeguards or guardrails to help mitigate those things because we expect everyone to be an expert. We expect everyone to know better, right? But the fact is, a lot of IT people are keeping the lights on.
Yeah.
They have a lot of different hats they have to wear, and they're not experts in everything, and mistakes happen. So I think that is a good example too of where there could be more improvements made, but aren't when it comes to kind of securing misconfigurations and things like that.
Yeah. No, I think that's fair.
So the next one kind of ties into what we said earlier too, with patching vulnerabilities sooner rather than later. And this section is speaking to how quickly vulnerabilities are remediated and or exploited. And kind of the gist of this is that patching vulnerabilities or patching critical vulnerabilities within 15 days of the patch being available is not fast enough anymore.
Yeah.
And it says it down here, and there's some interesting data. But when there is a vulnerability that's being targeted and it's being exploited, you don't have days, right? You have hours, hopefully, to put in a patch, to mitigate it, to take it offline, to do whatever you need to do. Because one thing that we're noticing is these vulnerabilities, like the MoveIts, Log4js, and you name it, as soon as they come out and there's a public statement, or as soon as it becomes known, that thing is being sprayed, that thing is being mass exploited very, very quickly. And there's numerous reports and data that support that evidence, including the DBIR. But it's moving faster, so it's more important than ever to be able to mitigate those quickly.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, man. And look, again, going back to basics and talking about blocking and tackling, step one is knowing what you have, is having proper inventory, having proper asset management. We had a external penetration test not too long ago that turned into an internal because they had an unpatched Microsoft Exchange box sitting on the internet. Bro, they didn't even use Exchange. It
Hmm.
was an old system that's still attached to Active Directory. They had already migrated to Entra and M365, and they just forgot that they had this box sitting out there. And so, that's probably when you start seeing on this chart where we're getting out to like 60 and 180 and 365 days
Hmm.
of unpatched, actively exploited vulnerabilities.
Yep.
Those people just don't know what they have, right?
Yep.
Or they just don't have vulnerability management at all, which is
Yep.
practically a crime at this point.
Yep.
But yeah, man. I mean, knowing what you have it's more than half the battle, man. It's like
Yep.
90% of the battle because I would be willing to bet most of these people that were sitting on unpatch move it after 55, 60 days, either were just completely unaware of what was going on or didn't know that they had move it.
Yep.
And so, man,
Yep.
it's
Yeah. And
hard to build a cyber program when your
yep.
fundamentals are missing. That's it.
Yeah, and the traditional advice was have a 30, 60, 90-day,
Hmm.
patch management window, right?
Yep.
You patch your highs and criticals within 30 days and et cetera, et cetera. So recommendation nowadays is if it's on the internet, it has to be patched within 24 hours, right?
Yeah.
That would be my perspective. Ideally sooner, right? But at least within 24 hours. If you can address it within 24 hours, you're probably have a good chance of getting in front of it. But in anything on the KEV list, so CISA keeps this known exploited vulnerabilities list.
Yeah.
So you should have some sort of plan in place for when these big vulnerabilities hit, or when there's things that are internet facing that have vulnerabilities. Those things just unequivocally should be patched as soon as humanly possible.
Yeah.
And then worry about everything else later.
Yeah, I agree, man. And again, context is everything. If it's on the KEB list, um, you know, if it's sitting on the public internet, like you said, if it checks these three boxes or whatever your criteria is,
Yep.
then whatever you're doing stops and you patch the system
Yep.
immediately. And so, we don't
Yep.
even, we
Yeah,
shouldn't even be
because
talking about SLAs. We should be talking about
yeah.
now,
Yep. Yeah, and honestly, we have similar perspectives on this, and we've talked about this before. But it doesn't matter if you've patched 5,000 critical, high, medium vulnerabilities in the last 365 days. If you get one vulnerability that hurts you, none of that ever mattered. You've
Yeah.
wasted all of that time, all of that money, all of those resources for nothing.
Yeah. Yeah, it's true. I agree.
So that was some of the core sections. What I also like about the DBIR is they break it down by industry. So they've
Yep.
got like financial services, healthcare, professional services. So there's three that I want to focus on because those are three that I have experience with, that you have experience with, and I think that will resonate with the audience. So the first is financial services. And in each of these sections, as you can see, they have, the frequency, the top patterns, motives, the data that's compromised. So this is a really good look into your industry. So you can go to each section here and you can look at your industry based on the NAIC codes and get a sense of what's going on, right? And this is very telling to me. This is a good way to get perspective on your industry. So system intrusion, miscellaneous errors, and social engineering represent 78% of the breaches. So these are the top patterns, right? So errors, social engineering, system intrusion was first, miscellaneous errors, and social engineering. So obviously, social engineering is something that we're going to see time and time again in a number of different industries, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
The interesting one to me is the errors, right? The errors to me is interesting because that is like, your AWS bucket that you just have open on the internet.
Yep.
Or sending the data to somebody else, or misconfiguring something else that allows a threat actor in. that to me is interesting, and it's something that we've seen time and time again. But um, interesting statistics nonetheless.
Yeah, and the errors one, I expect to be a little bit higher in these specific market verticals, and here's why. Um, unlike other industries, like let's say legal, for example, which we have a lot of experience in, we have to, in the banking and insurance industry, create opportunities for bidirectional communication with our clients, right? And so what I mean by that is, and we're talking high risk stuff, right? So like in the insurance industry, you guys are exchanging PII, you're exchanging documents that are signed with social security numbers, and there's this kind of bidirectional document that has to, documentation, credentials, applications, etc. And usually there's multiple, like just for me, for like homeowners insurance, automobile insurance, motorcycle, like there's all these different interfaces. And so every time you create one of these interfaces, you're exponentially increasing your attack surface. And it's even worse in the banking world because you've got mortgages, you've got online banking, and all of these other things that require you to receive stuff from clients
Mhm.
or give information to them. So now you've got dev environments, test environments. Those are usually where I expect to see problems, is when we accidentally connect our test environment to a production database.
Yep.
Or, like you said, we spin up what's supposed to be a test bucket, and it ends up getting production data put on it. And so that kind of stuff, when you have this many moving parts, especially in the large finance and banking environment, there's at any time. I think one of our larger global clients here at Security 360 has like hundreds, literally hundreds of web applications in various states
Yep.
of internet accessibility and test dev, etc.
Yep.
And man, look, you're one button click away. So
Yep.
yeah, so this is not super surprising to me. I kind of expect it in this industry. What is surprising to me is that we're reporting it in this category, and
Yep.
I'm a fan because it's a real category.
Yep.
The errors. So
Yeah, and interestingly, they say that basic web application attacks, which was number one last year for this industry, has fallen off. And their kind of summary of this is that this seems to indicate that attackers are being forced to work a bit harder to compromise organizations in this sector, which is great, which shows progress in the industry. But some interesting in data nonetheless. Healthcare. So we've got healthcare, and then we're going to have professional services, and then we'll wrap up after that. So healthcare is also an interesting one. It's a difficult one. The patterns are the same as well, or similar, right?
yeah.
We have miscellaneous errors, we have privilege misuse, and we have system intrusion for 83% of the breaches. And then it goes on to say that insiders deliberately causing breaches have surged back into second place after a steady decline in 2018.
That's wild.
Which is interesting, right? So essentially pointing out that the insider threat thing that we have been worried about for a while, which kind of wasn't, it was talked about like 5 years ago. It was like insider threat. And then it didn't really materialize. And the DBR and other reports supported that. But now, according to this, there's kind of been an increase again in malicious insiders. So definitely interesting, especially when you consider the fact at the end where it talks about the data that's compromised is personal data. Now, this is the healthcare category, healthcare industry, but personal data is on top of medical data as the preferred target.
It makes sense though, right? Because what are you going to do with medical data as a threat actor?
Right.
So yeah, and hospitals process a ton of transactions, financial transactions specifically, and are sitting on top of a ton of identity information. So I mean, it tracks.
Yep. Yeah, it's definitely interesting. There's definitely a shift of insider threats, of personal data being particularly interesting. And maybe that supports the case that personal data is more extortable, right?
Yeah.
You can't necessarily change your biological issues or your illnesses, and at some point, does it matter? Whereas personal data, like you said, credit card numbers and sensitive information like that
Yeah.
is maybe much more tangible to buy and sell.
Yeah. I agree. I think that's a fair assessment of it.
So, last one before we wrap up is professional services, which includes the legal industry. So,
Mhm.
um, this one is again um, has its own trends and interesting data to it, and I'll let you the listener kind of dig more into it in detail. But personal data, credentials still on top, right? They're still looking for those things. Social engineering, errors, system intrusion still on top. But ransomware accounted for 24% of the breaches, and
Mhm.
BEC accounted for 20%.
Yeah.
So between ransomware and BEC, that's 44% of all breaches is one of those two things,
Sure. Sure.
one of those two issues. And then it goes on to say social engineering was 40% of all breaches, and 20% of that was the result of pretexting. So
Wow.
social engineering is definitely an issue.
So for those of you that don't know, pretexting is making up a fake story or creating a scenario to trick people into doing something. And
Yep,
so it's kind of at the heart of what we do in the offensive security world for social engineering is picking up the phone and calling the help desk and asking for them to reset a password on that we don't own, by the way, because of this emergency situation that we've made up. Um, it's wild to see that at that level happening in this industry, but it's not super surprising.
yep,
I guess it's a little more surprising that more organizations in these market verticals aren't focusing on that, right?
yep,
Like big drive for user education,
yep,
have campaigns run against you. And I'm not talking about know before. Know before is cool, man, but we've all already become accustomed and acclimated to
yep,
know before, right? We know
yep,
we're going to get that phishing email once a month, right? We're on the lookout for it. As soon as we see something that doesn't
yep,
that I don't know how to describe it, but there's some kind of mental thing going on there where you're like, oh yeah, that's my monthly phishing email.
yep,
And so we kind of blow it off, and then that opens up the door to somebody to call our phone, or reach out through a contact form on a website, or
yep,
hit us up in Teams. And so we're
yep,
kind of stuck in that. Yeah, 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 we're gonna do our monthly phishing email. Cool,
yep,
nobody clicked on it. Give us a big green checkbox. But what are the threat actors really doing? You know?
yeah. Yeah, and I think so. I had this conversation on Twitter the other day. Is that these reports and others say all the things that we already knew.
Hmm.
But the reason I like it is it puts data behind it. There's some tangible results behind it to say, hey, we have data to support these things that we believe are intuition. And then the other thing is, I think this speaks to security culture a lot. So the culture of the organization, the culture of the IT team, the culture of the firm, um, of just meeting people where they're at and teaching them and
Yeah,
educating them. And I think it's these metrics specifically speak to that because, as we know, especially in the legal industry, it can be hard to kind of get people to see the light of taking some of these threats seriously, or trying to do better at identifying these things and identifying the red flags. So I think it
yeah,
speaks to that for sure.
yeah. And I do, man. I'm like you. For me, if I'm a CISO or I'm a decision maker, in the cyberspace in my organization, I'm looking at this thing, man, because this is the reality of tens of thousands of companies who are being impacted by these breaches. And so
Yep.
if I don't want to be that guy, then I want to do all the things that defeats all the things in this report, right?
Yep.
And maybe I don't put emphasis as much anymore on
Yep.
layer 7 firewalls,
Yep.
or whatever the next super fancy whiz bang thing is.
Yep.
Maybe I worry about, again, how good's my inventory, dude?
Yep.
How good's my emergency patching process? So yeah, I think there's a tremendous amount
Yeah.
of value in these reports. I'm glad to see Verizon doing them. And it's awesome. It's good stuff.
Yeah. And the last thing I'll say is, I used to use in my last job, I worked in the financial services industry, and I used to use this as evidence to say, hey,
Mhm.
these are all the projects that we have going on. Here's the things that we're focusing on. Here's what the Verizon DBIR says is important in our industry, or things that are happening, the top patterns, the
Yeah,
motivations, or whatever. Here's what we're doing to protect personal data, to protect credentials. Like, here's what
yeah,
we're doing, and here's how it maps to it. So that can be a good takeaway for IT managers, CISOs, to say, hey, here's all the security stuff that we're focusing on. Here's the new
yeah,
projects, stuff we've done. Here's how it maps to what these industry reports say is important. And that will also, that not only helps you make look good as an operator and say, hey, we're focusing on the right things,
yeah,
but it can also be used to get increased budget, or to get more resources, or to get another teammate and be like, hey, look at, this is a really big problem. We should focus and invest more in this area, so we're not in one of these statistics. So it can help you get more resources as well.
yeah. I agree, and I'll tell you too. One of the things that our CISO used to make us do is when this report came out, he would say, "Okay, now you write a report on how we're addressing everything in this report."
Mm,
And I used to get so frustrated about it because I'm like, dude, I could just tell you, I can put this in an email, blah blah blah. But he was right, and in hindsight, looking back on it, we were actually rating our preparedness on each one of these things, and we would very quickly realize, hey, we're a 3 out of 10 on this particular threat vector, and we need to bolster that up. And had we
mm.
not done that self analysis
Yep.
based on what Verizon was telling us other people are being impacted by, we wouldn't have known that necessarily,
Yep.
because we had things in place, but maybe they weren't ideal for where the threats are currently. Maybe they were yet last year's threats. And so,
Yep.
I'm not encouraging anybody to go make work for your cyber guys, okay? But there is some value in comparing where you are to
Yep.
what's in this report. All right, folks, that's all we have time for today. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please like, subscribe, share, all that good stuff really helps us out. And we'll see you next Wednesday.